my pleasure and privilege to be with all of you representing diverse issues in higher education at this critical moment in higher education, spotlighting issues of equal opportunity and diversity, making sure that nobody gets left behind in this rush to go online amid this COVID-19 crisis. We will be covering three high-level topics: anxiety about online performance and instruction, technology as a scapegoat for declines in student performances, and moving the needle toward online access for all. Will that be a reality, or is that just a delusion? I want to introduce all of you to our outstanding panel of experts today who will be sharing their wisdom with us. First, we have Dr. Ken Coopwood, co-founder of Cooplu. Next, we have Ms. Kelly Herman, Vice President of Accessibility, Equity, and Inclusion for the University of Phoenix. And last but not least, Dr. Amber Smith is with us, Vice President for Inclusion and Equity at the University of Indianapolis. Panel, welcome, and thank you so very much for joining us today. I have one question that I'd like to get started with to all panelists, and please jump in as you see fit. The first question that I want to pose to all panelists is this: what are the gains or losses in terms of equity and accessibility in this new normal of being online due to COVID? Panel, that's the first question I have for you today.
Okay, I guess we didn't decide who's going to go first, but I can certainly jump in if the ladies, is that okay?
Yeah, I was waiting on you.
Okay.
So that's fine. I expected that was going to happen.
Okay. Yeah. Well, first, David, I just want to thank you and the entire diverse team for having myself, representative of Kuplu, and the other panelists on there today. I'd like to just thank you for doing this, and thank you for leading the country as a true organization that had its finger on the pulse of higher education, particularly the day-to-day experiences for professionals of color. And so we're thankful. Kuplu is thankful for being a part of your 35-year history of service. So congratulations on that.
Yeah.
So just for my comments, I'd like to start with a thought about that first question, and really all three of them. And that is, it's an African proverb. It's basically, in a moment of crisis, the wise build bridges and the foolish build dams. And I chose that because I believe we're not here to stop or block the inevitable, nor to make people more fearful or build anxiety, but instead we're here to encourage and help people to think so that we don't let that fear and anxiety result in poor application of what we know, and worst case scenario, make more poor policy as we go forward. I think we're here to help those who want it to cross over those bridges into new ways of thinking and serving higher education. So with regard to the first point, then, I think that in terms of what's gained and what could be lost from equity and accessibility possibilities, I first think about the difference between situational analyses and causal thinking. And I think that we're really at a crossword now, because when you, even right now, if you look out around higher education and other webinars that are happening nationally, you hear a lot of people talking about, well, how many COVID cases on your campus, how many students you have left, who's online and who's not, and you know, where's the ghost towns in terms of institutional environment, et cetera. And all those things, while entertaining, I find that they're distracting from what I think we really need to talk about. And those are causal type questions, as in, how will the campus technology, the capacity that it has, change the professorship right now and going forward? What will be the impact, for example, of your new grading systems? And what is, as our question says, what's real or delusional about the conditions of the institution before COVID happened that will impact the way it can go forward from here? So when I think about those differences in what people are talking about versus what we could be talking about, I think that we are on a teeter-totter between what will be gained and what will be lost when it comes to equity and access for what's going to be the new normal. So to add to that, and then I'll be quiet, is just, I believe that right now we're at a point in history for higher education where biases that have been present in the past can actually increase and exacerbate in some very unseen ways, which makes it all the more dangerous. I'm talking about biases that differentiate the student body into different kinds of students, that put faculty into different categories and administrators into different associations. And there's a lot of research to speak about the danger in categories and in associations and kinds of people. And you want to be careful now that we're facing a invisible audience, if you will, more and more, that these biases don't take root in the systems or the new infrastructures that will represent the new normal. So it's about the diversity we don't see now that keeps factors like bias and race actually in the forefront, and perhaps even more pronounced than they were in the past. So that's my take on the first question.
Well, Kelly, I would like you to follow up on some
Sure.
of the things that Ken mentioned. You know, of course, at the University of Phoenix, you've been doing this work before it became popular, making sure that issues of diversity are not forgotten for students who are online. Any thoughts about gains and losses as everybody's rushing to go online?
Yeah, thanks, David. And thanks, Ken, for starting us off as well. And I think, when I look at, gains and losses, I think that we actually just had a conversation with those of us who are kind of on the response team and figuring out what do we do as we've moved our physical, in-person classes to more virtual course meetings, because we do actually have those as well at the University of Phoenix. And yes, we've been very, very, very well set up to be able to, offer students the online mechanism and the online modality. But when it came to some of our ground campus locations, it was still kind of a pretty traditional structure. And so I think where the gains are is that this is really an invitation for folks to start thinking very creatively about what sort of learning opportunities can we provide to students, and how do we look at, our diverse student body at the University of Phoenix. Our students are very, very diverse. So when we think about our goals around equity and inclusion and diversity for our students, we're not looking to diversify our student body. We're looking to make sure that our educational offerings are actually reflective of our student body, and that it's preparing them for, the world of work. When, our students come to us, most of them are working adults already. They have experience. We want to be able to help them see how that experience fits into their education and how they can then, be able to connect it to their career. And so opportunities for networking, considering cultural competence, thinking about representation, is sometimes a very different conversation for us, and where I've, been part of those conversations in more traditional forms of higher education. The one thing that I do want to kind of specifically, call attention to, though, are our students with disabilities. And that's my primary area of expertise. And I've received a lot of phone calls and a lot of emails over the last 2 weeks from colleagues across the nation wondering, how do we do this for students with disabilities, especially for those institutions that have not been very well set up with accessibility policies to make sure that the technology is going to work for our students. And so this is also one of those opportunities where I think, I'm going to play on Ken's, a teeter-totter, analogy for a second, because I think we're at this moment where institutions that have been focused on accessibility and have recognized they have to build that into some of their processes in order for all students to have an equitable experience, and those that haven't are kind of at this, moment in time where the decisions that they make now can either push them over the edge in a good way or push them over the edge in a not so good way. And so we want to be able to make sure that we're having conversations on campus about what doing remote work means for a student with a disability, what that means for when the campus comes back to life in September, because most of our campuses I think are looking towards the spring semester and moving virtual and not coming back to in-person classes until the fall semester. There are a lot of policies and procedures we have in place that emphasize attendance, that emphasize residency requirements, that emphasize traditional norms of higher education for students with disabilities that can sometimes be really, really difficult challenges. And so I'm hoping that the great opportunity we have here is that we can provide some more gains by thinking creatively and thinking outside of the box about how do we kind of think about what it means to offer education to our students and what it means for something to be a fundamental alteration or a reduction of standards so that we can offer access to more of our students, especially those who might have disabilities.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And Amber, I was wondering if you could jump in here. It's interesting in our preparation call, I think you might have mentioned that the issues that we're facing are the same. It's a different platform, but the issues are similar. From your perspective, winners and losers, gains and losses amid all of this rush to go online amid COVID. I was wondering if you could jump in, Amber.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me today as well. I'm very excited to engage in this conversation. Yeah, I think that when we think about the gains that have occurred, one is we are forced to collaborate beyond silos at this point. And so we're having to respond to a crisis. And a lot of times, as you all know, working in higher education, it's very easy to kind of go and you do your thing in your pocket. And this has required us to really recognize the expertise across the campuses, right? And so that's one thing that I think has been a gain. Another gain is that there have been a lot of people who have been very standoffish and distant when you think about educating students online, right? And students as well, when they go, oh, I can never do that. I can never do an online course. So just the simple idea of having to begin to engage in another platform, I think can be a gain. However, we are already faced within academic classrooms problems with pedagogy that connect with underrepresented populations. We already face numerous issues as it relates to even just appealing to various learning styles. I feel like when we had to make such a quick transition, then that becomes a little bit more even exacerbated. Why? Because typically people are going to try to do exactly what they did in the classroom in an online space. And that's not necessarily the best way to teach in an online space. Because in a classroom, you have different kinds of energy that's being conveyed. I get to see you, you get to see me. A lot of my students have even expressed that, man, I'm gonna have a problem because I can't see and talk to the people that I'm in the class with or my faculty member. It's gonna be very different, and there's an anxiety associated with the isolation and trying to figure your way through not only the academic coursework, but also the connection. And so all of us have had an opportunity to go to a movie or to engage in a conversation where we felt a connection so much so that we may have ended up in tears. Right? We may have ended up moved for the rest of our lives, or our behavior changed from that connection. And I think it's important to think about not what we can't do. So I can't do this because I'm online. I can't do this. It's how can I connect, right? So it's not when we think in terms of the point being connection, and this is going to be in the classroom and outside of the classroom, we connect for the purposes of engagement. When we think about it from that standpoint, and how can I connect, then our mind begins to change and we begin to think about practical tools. Netflix, for example, just released something called Netflix Party, right? Where everyone can watch at the same time. I can think of various ways that can be utilized in the diversity officer space, as well as the faculty member space. Other things that I've begun to explore in this format is ways to engage people in the conversation that are in this Zoom classroom with me, right? So that means that students, I say, okay, I want you to take a picture that is exploring this, right? And then they get to present that, and that creates a different kind of engagement in this platform. And so how can we connect better? Not I can't do because of, but how can I in this format? And I think that challenges us to open up our brain to ideas. The other thing is to recognize our energy. When you're online, it's different than when you're in person. And so our energy has to be a little bit higher. You know, maybe sometimes we gotta use our voice inflections differently, because just like if you were watching something on television, if somebody talks like this the whole time, you're gonna lose interest and you're gonna switch the channel, right? So, and so just there's some simple things that I don't think that we've had to think about, but there's some practical things that we can apply that can allow us to make the connection. And so I think that if we transition our thought to how can I connect? And there are numerous ways to do that, and to begin to rely, okay, so look, I'm very creative. You know people that are, call them, talk to them, right? Because it's important that you recognize that this is where creativity has to prevail in order for us to actually have the impact and engagement that we have to have in this situation. So yes, you're right. I do believe that we are facing a lot of the same scenarios online, but that they can become even more exacerbated because we're one, anxious about the technology, but also just because many of us have not explored this format from an educational standpoint. And so I think that it's important that we recognize that there are opportunities here for us to grow as a professional, as a faculty member, and as well as a student, you know.
And Ken, you know, when we talk about new possibilities amid this new normal, obviously a lot of the news has been somewhat negative. If we talk about digital divide, we talk about students who have never really had experience with online instruction, who are apprehensive about the concept of not being able to see their instructor, to go to actual office hours. Ken, what are some of the possibilities? You know, what are some of the gains you think might be able to be realized amid our new normal?
Well, you know, thank you again, David. And as I spoke earlier, I think that the fundamental degree to which we gain anything, I think, rests in any institution's capacity to recognize that we are at ground zero with regard to distance learning and virtual instruction. We can start completely over now. It's expected that we do this, as Amber was saying, with all different types of ideas and creative thinking that needs to be welcomed and to come forward with a very robust and new level of zeal. When these things when the platform is clear for that type of thinking, then we're talking about a gain in my mind that is authentically incorporating infrastructure for, as Amber mentioned, students with disabilities, different abilities, economic circumstances, sexuality, gender, etc. We're in position to think better about who will be impacted with the change, why the impact is needed for that particular population, and how the impact should be delivered. And when we can get to a point or a place where where we're ushering in the amount and degree of creativity that is necessary to do the things that Amber and Kelly have spoke about, then we can talk about new possibilities that open up that new normal. But we have to be real about where we are now. That's why I started us with this thing about causal thinking, but it's in another way to say causal thinking is equity mindedness in your thinking process.
Kelly, as we are talking here about possibilities, gains and losses, clearly there will be something that we're going to lose in terms of the face-to-face interaction, right? It's interesting, amid all the technology that we have in this world, people still spend thousands of dollars to go to meetings, right? Because there is something to this whole being able to see somebody face-to-face, especially with instructor-student relationships, right? And so what can be done, do you think, Kelly, to make up some of those voids that are inevitably going to be lost because students and teachers can't actually shake their heads in this new normal?
So yeah, and I think that's a really good point, David. And I think, it's one of the things that a lot of our faculty at the University of Phoenix who only teach in our ground modality have been worried about. And then, following some of the conversations on Twitter from, faculty at more traditional institutions, that's also something that they're concerned about. And I think that the modality that you're using to connect with your students, to go back to some of Amber's points earlier about that connection and how, critical that is, we've encouraged our faculty that when they're using Blackboard Collaborate for their virtual class meetings, that they have their videos on, because when you're able to see each other, and as I'm talking, I can watch for both Amber and Ken's and David your reaction, and that actually makes me feel more connected, like we're actually having a conversation in the room. And I think that that's a really critical piece of it, is to rely on all of the technology that we have at our disposal. What I've seen and what I've heard from some colleagues who work in instructional design is a huge concern that they have about that any ground that they've been able to make with faculty about the legitimacy of online education could go out the window, and their field as a whole, whether or not it is legitimate, whether they're the methodology that they use to develop courses. Well, if we could do all of this in 2 weeks, why does it take you 3-4 months to build a course, kind of thing. And that's something that I think we have to be really prepared for at our campuses as well, because there is a pedagogy around designing an online course. It's not just as simple as saying we're going to take everything that we would have done in the classroom and we're going to put it online. You have to really think about the modality and adjust your learning objectives, adjust your plan according to what modality that you're using. And so I think that has the potential to both be a great opportunity, but also has the potential to be a huge loss, in terms of the way that we in higher education look at online learning, and then be able to continue making our plans for what the future of online learning is after this crisis. I saw one article that went around, and I didn't have a chance to read it yet, but the headline was, please do a bad job. Do a bad job of putting these courses online right now, right? And it's, from the instructional design perspective, because we don't want to devalue the contributions that our colleagues in instructional design actually make to what our online courses should be. So I think that this is a really pivotal moment. And I think the way that we in higher ed, especially those of us who are in administrative roles, how we get together to debrief what happened, what went well, what didn't go well, how our students reacted to it. One of the things that we talked about at the University of Phoenix is getting that feedback from our students. And granted, we were very well positioned for this, sort of transition, but we're still getting both positive and negative feedback from our students, that we can use in constructive ways to make it better. And I think that we as administrators have to be really intentional about bringing folks together, working across those silos to debrief what went well, so that we can capitalize on the things that did go well, so that we can kind of be able to not silence, because all voices are important, right? But to be able to counteract some of the naysayers that are going to take this, situation that we're in and say, see, this is why online learning doesn't work, because this is a completely different situation for online learning than what a traditional online learning is.
Can I just say something on what you just said, please? I want to just specify. I'm really glad you brought that up, because instructional design is a profession that, first of all, if no one respected it before, I think that they should definitely respect it now. I had to explain to students, I've had to explain that, understand that this is not a tradition, this is not the way a typical online course would run. Don't look at this as this is a reflection of true online. I said, we had to build this in a week, right? So you have a plethora of different approaches. There's not a standardization in an approach right now because we're responding to a crisis. And I think, and that's been a concern of mine as well, because online education can be done very well. And there are examples where it has been done very well. But this is not a reflection of that. This is a reflection of a response to an emergency crisis to ensure that our students were able to maintain their educational experience, right? So there was not a lost semester. We want students to be able to keep, right, what they've done thus far and also get the credit for this semester. So this is what that is. This is more reflective to me of distance education in a lot of situations rather than online learning that reflects the way that instructional designers have been trained to craft these experiences. And so I'm glad you brought that up because I think that's very important to note here. And I think that it's important to keep that separation as administrators. So when we are in those spaces and we have to discuss and debrief, I think it's very important to recognize and be able to address those issues. I think there's also a difference in the, when we think about the technological training that faculty have, I mean, we have large generational differences, right? And so there's an anxiety if you are a digital immigrant and not a digital native, you did not grow up with this technology, this can be very anxiety producing for you. Absolutely. And so I think when we think about diversity, there's also generations, right, that we have to consider. And so those things are affecting the way that learners are engaging in this space as well. And that speaks specifically to what you were saying regarding the design, Kelly. And I just think that those are things to just really be mindful of as we look at what's going on right now and try to negotiate our way through that.
It's interesting. This conversation kind of brings up issues with regards to assessment, right? Because this crisis is coming close to finals, right? And so we know that there are a lot of issues when it comes to diversity around testing and assessments, right? Are we accurately gauging our students, especially diverse students who don't necessarily have the background or preparation at the K through 12 level that gives them the advantages of more privileged students? And so I'm interested, Kelly, as we talk about, for instance, this issue of assessments. We have so many institutions that now suddenly have to go from in-person exams to virtual exams. And the naysayers might say, wow, this is just a reason why this is never going to work, right? And so what about this issue of practically assessments? We have many instructors and administrators saying, you know what, this has never worked properly. This is not going to work properly. What would you say to some of those who are grappling with, wow, am I going to be able to get a fair assessment given what's happening right now? Or do we need to do cancellations? What about that issue, Kelly?
Yeah, thanks, David. And this is an issue that actually comes up a lot for us when we work in the accessibility and disability services space, because a lot of the requests come in to say, I need to be able to have my students taking these exams, these assessments, they have to be proctored because I have to make sure that they're not cheating, because when you do things online, they can have access to way too much information. And my answer always back to that is, are you really sure that's the way you want to assess students' learning in an online course? And this is, I think, a perfect follow-up to what we just discussed about the, value of our instructional design colleagues, because one of the things that they can help us do is to craft an assessment of student learning that takes into consideration the modality within which the student is going to be, number one, learning, and then number two, taking that assessment and demonstrating what they've learned. And if one thing that I've learned over the 15 or so years that I've worked most directly with online courses is that a standard, regurgitate information kind of test isn't necessarily always the best way to assess student learning when you're in an online course. So if you have access to all of the material because you're taking an online course, what should your assessment look like? Well, maybe now, instead of thinking about, straight regurgitation and multiple choice answers where you're picking, from among all of the answers that look right, that sometimes multiple course tests, I still have some nightmares about that from my own education. Right. But maybe it is, how do you apply these principles? How do you take, these concepts, the various things, excuse me, that you're learning in your course, and how do you apply them in practical ways so that the student can say, hey, you know what, in this marketing class, I actually got it. I understand what it means when you talk about, user experience and usability, or you can totally tell this is actually not my area of expertise because I'm trying to pull words that sound like they're related. But, how do you take those foundational concepts from a course and then apply it in a way that demonstrates that the student has learned? And so that would be my advice first and foremost, and that actually also helps make our courses and our assessments more accessible for students with disabilities as well, because a lot of times we will talk about, when we're looking at an accommodation strategy or an accessibility strategy, that are we really assessing student learning, or are we assessing the impact of the disability? And that's something that we have to be careful for. And I think that is one of the things that also, when you look at underrepresented student populations, when you look at the educational backgrounds of some of our students, we see this a lot with adult students who typically have a really long space of time between their last formal schooling and when they come to the University of Phoenix, and that some of those foundational skills need a lot of brushing up, but yet they can't take the time to brush up on all of those skills because they have goals to meet. They have, they need to provide for their families. So when we really kind of think outside of the box about what assessment really looks like, I think we open up a lot more opportunities to say, well, let's take advantage of the modality that we have. Let's see how students would apply this learning, and let's make sure that students understand how this connects to whether it's their future career goals, whether it's the various other practical applications, so that we can make that learning richer for the student.
Yeah, and Ken, what about that issue? We talked obviously about instructional design. Kelly's talked about there are obviously institutions who are there, and there's institutions that are scrambling to get there, right, on the fly. And finals are around the corner. And some will ask, hey, is this even doable? I was wondering if you could weigh in, Ken, when it comes to assessments on the fly and making sure that issues of diversity aren't lost as we're trying to get everybody online.
Yeah, I think one, Kelly, your comments are spot on, and it's obviously you're obviously an expert in that area. So I enjoyed listening to that. That was really good.
Yeah,
But to your point, David, it's true. A lot can be lost, and especially when we rush. And as I mentioned earlier, it's important that as we go through this crisis, that we know the difference in thinking so that we don't lose certain things. So for example, some people say, this is a crisis, and it is for like the University of Phoenix because they've been doing it so long. But for other institutions, this is a disaster. Okay? This is a disaster. And disaster management is, in my experience, different from crisis management, because when you talk about disaster, you're talking about the need to transform an entire infrastructure. Yes. Instead of building, I mentioned bridges and dams, instead of building a dam to stop a particular problem. Maybe faculty need more development in order to really move from one stage of instruction to another. And for the University of Phoenix, well, that may be something we can handle in a relatively short period of time. But when you have other institution types, the more brick and mortar ones, when we're talking about retraining faculty, and particularly a vast majority of them, to prevent a disaster in terms of gross decline in student enrollment and students not returning, we're talking about a complete paradigm shift here, and a complete new way of thinking that, if not done carefully and critically, we're going to end up with another disaster on top of that disaster. But we'll lose what I come to think of as culturally relevant and affirming technology. Okay, and when I talk about that, I'm talking about, again, building that bridge for social presence for people who probably thought they were invisible in the first place.
Right.
Okay? Now they're back online in another place where they could potentially be invisible. I'm talking about, as you said, Kelly, having instruction that allows a student to process and come to understand and move from understanding to application, okay, from a distance perspective. And the modality necessary to do that for some people is or gaining the capacity and dealing with the modalities to do that. For some people, is a disaster waiting to happen because they've never been trained, they've never been exposed, and they've never had to. You see, and now it's a matter of performance for me as an individual, and I'm untrained. So that's a really pretty distinctive realm of thinking that we need to consider. And the last thing when I think about that culturally relevant and affirming technology is having to do with an engaged faculty person who spends time with the students to move them to those higher levels of thinking and application that is possible when you're in the day-to-day grind with your student and understanding, again, as Kelly said, hey, they got to take care of their family. They have a whole list of external pressures while they're trying to learn. So all those things that I talked about can be lost if there's ultimately no authentic investment in that transformation to address the disaster for some people.
Yeah, Amber, I was wondering if you can jump in. I saw you reacted to Ken at a couple of points.
Yes, I did.
What about this disaster situation we're facing?
Well, yes, I did. I think that yes, I did. I was going to say that because you are right. A lot of your traditional higher education institutions are having to face some very unique challenges. And I want to point out, we're much lower on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We're concerned with food and shelter for our students, right? And so I'm fortunate to be at an institution where the president is mindful and cognizant of the variety of needs, and there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So we did not, for example, tell every single last student in our residence halls to go home. Why? Because we understand in our population, and every school is different, but in our population, we have students where this is home, right? So when they checked into that residence hall, they have another home. And there's nowhere else for them to go. So those are some things that you might not think about on the day. As you mentioned, Dr. Cootwood, we're talking about an infrastructural change, right? In that now we have to figure out we have to make sure our students eat, right? So we can't just completely shut down dining services. There's a modification. This is something that we've never had to essentially endure for an extended period of time like this, right? Before you go into summer, you're going into summer, right? You can do assessments and you can determine who's going to be and all this stuff. You didn't have that opportunity. But it's important to recognize that the one-size-fits-all approach is oftentimes, very rarely if ever, works in the classroom, and oftentimes very rarely if ever will work, as you say, Dr. Cootwood, in disaster management, right? Because, and I think that's what a disaster really looks like. I can honestly say that I feel like we're more so in crisis mode at our institution. Like I said, I'm fortunate to be working with an administrative team that has a lot more insight associated to what the student's experience is. I think a disaster is when you ignore those concerns. And that is when equity and inclusion is not considered, the diverse needs of your population, because it just makes sense, or business-wise, it just is what, I think that's where you get into a disaster situation. And I don't think that that's something that we can afford to do. And I think sometimes we lose what's right to do. For some reason, sometimes we can get to the point where, it's not convenient, but it's the right thing to do. And I think that it's important to recognize that we have to be mindful of what equity really looks like. It's not that it's always convenient, or that it is even all the time necessarily the most profitable. But I genuinely believe when you invest in integrity, you will get a return on your investment. And I'm happy to say that I can honestly say that I believe that we've been able to do that. But those are some of the things that food technology, we've had to see what student has or does not have computers, right? Because this is not the way that we have educated the majority of our students. So if they don't have a computer, we can't just leave computer labs open forever. Why? Because we can't have people congregating, right? So you have food to consider, technology, housing. Those are some of the main things when you think about gains and losses. In order for it not to be a loss, we had to look at those things as it related to each individual student. And so I think if you can look at those things and be honest about where you are at your institution, you can avoid a disaster scenario, in my opinion.
Thank you so much,
Agreed.
Amber.
Agreed.
You know, at this time, I'd actually like to turn things over to the audience for a Q&A session. We've had a number of questions that have come in from our audience, and I'd like to thank all of you so much for asking your questions. And I have one important question that is coming in from our audience that I'd like to pose to Kelly. And this question is with regards to pedagogical techniques that are especially problematic or could have the risk of disparate impact. People having the best intentions with pedagogical techniques that are especially problematic from a diversity perspective. And so, Kelly, any advice for people working on the fly on pedagogy in terms of what to do and what not to do as they are dealing with this crisis?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a really good question, especially as, we're kind of getting adjusted to this new world order and trying to do it in very, very rapid fashion. My I think my primary, piece of advice is to, really think through that how you are representing the information to the students, and then how you're asking the students to, respond to it and interact with it. So one of the things that we talk about a lot, and it, in accessibility and disability services, is this concept of universal design for learning. And there are a lot of, various components and features of universal design that, the key point here is to make the environment more usable by the most, number of people possible. And so when we think about how we're flipping, everything into, this remote instruction, virtual, meetings and virtual class meetings versus, true online instruction, I think my how I would respond to that is to think about pedagogy from the standpoint of not emphasizing any one thing over another. So what do I mean by that? Let's say you are doing a screencast video for your students because you're a faculty member and you want to show them how to locate something. One of the things that we know can be problematic is that if you, just kind of use, the language that you choose to use, are you using a lot of jargon that maybe students don't have, sufficient background in, and they won't understand what you're talking through? So keeping your language simple, I think, is important. But the other piece is making sure that you are narrating what you're doing. And it's not so much of, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to click this and I'm going to do that. This and that, what does that mean? Let's give students that reference point in terms of what it is that you're doing. Well, I'm going to navigate to the Microsoft Word icon on my desktop. It looks like a piece of paper with a W on it. And then I'm going to open it up, and you have various file options. When you open that file up, you can choose a template. What does a template mean? And walking through students through that a little bit. So maybe taking a few extra steps as you're designing some of those learning opportunities for students, to make it clear what it is that you're doing, and not assuming that, number one, everyone can see what you're doing, that they can hear what you're doing, or that they have the sufficient background to be able to immediately jump in and do it the way that you did it. You can take a step back, think about someone who's never been exposed to it before, and build that into, the curriculum that you're designing at this point in time for this juncture. I think the other piece, and it's not so much pedagogy, but I think it's just best practice as an educator, and I think we take this for granted a lot, is talk to your students. One of the things that, we have kind of highlighted and emphasized with our faculty is that it's okay for you to say to the student, hey, I'm not that familiar with Blackboard Collaborate either. Let's muddle through and figure it out together. Or this is a brand new normal for me as well. I'm missing that in-person, contact with you just like you are. or you're a student who's being impacted because your kids are out of school, you still have to go to work, you can't rely on grandma and grandpa to watch the kids because that they're immunocompromised, and maybe because of social distancing you don't want to expose them to kids, because we all know that our school age kids are probably carriers of lots of other germs, not just this particular virus. So talking to the student about what would help you in this instance and really make that student a partner in their education, I think those are the things that I would focus on at this point in time, because all of the rule books in terms of the things that we would expect to do, and I think we've all talked about this throughout the first 45 minutes we've been together, that's out the window. But let's not lose sight of what's really important, which is giving the student some agency in that as well, and trying to think outside of the box.
Another question that's come up from our audience is around the testing assessment issue that we brought up earlier. One question is that a number of institutions are considering a variation of pass-fail grading models, right? They may have had all types of face-to-face assessments for finals set up, but now they're trying to rearrange that for some pass-fail variants. Amber, what equity issues do you see when it comes to institutions saying, you know what, let's just do pass-fail or some sort of variance amid the crisis?
That's a very good question. And the reality of the situation is that because we are, as institutions, trying to figure out not solely, what I like about it is the fact that we're trying to think outside of the box about how this could be impacting the student. This was done suddenly in the middle of, in the middle of a semester. This was something that students had not planned for, faculty and staff had not planned for. And what I hear institutions saying is that we're not 100% sure how it's going to impact everyone. We want to provide some options. And so in that way, I'm really excited about hearing the dialogue around a pass-fail as an option. And I've heard other things as well. I've heard things like pass-fail as an option or a letter grade as an option. And people are scrambling to figure this out. I think that when you talk about equity and inclusion, I think that it's important to consider that what you're proposing is a tailored approach. And I think tailoring, in other words, for me, this pass-fail would work. For someone over there, this would work. For someone over there, this would work. And to say that we're open to discussing what would be best to provide a final assessment in this, a grade in this situation, I think speaks volumes for where higher education is, because that historically has not been the case. We're riddled with policies and practices and procedures without any consideration for how it impacts the student. I mean, you understand what I'm saying, because we have to essentially have everything. And what this says, regardless of if we could argue all day about what's best and what's not, but what this says is we're open to considering possibilities based on our current situation. And we recognize that every student is not the same. And every student is not good. Maybe our forms of our final grade assessment is not the best for this case, similar to what Kelly was just saying, right? So yeah, all this time you may have used a measure where you tested, but a Q&A and multiple choice. But now based on this format, maybe I need to think of something different. And that's what it shows me that administrators are doing. I remember when I was an undergrad, I took a philosophy class, and in my final, I was supposed to write a paper for my final form of assessment. But what I was doing was I was comparing songs, and I was looking at how women were portrayed in songs. So instead, what I did was I made a recording, and I took my friend and we discussed these songs, and I turned that in as my final. And this was not an option, right? This was something that I chose to do because I thought it was a better, now I'm not encouraging anybody to do that, but that's what I did. And my point is that form of assessment is something that could easily be done here. At that time, I was recording on a tape, but this is a form of assessment that could easily be done using technology right now, right? And I ended up with the A in the class because my professor was open-minded to that format, even though he hadn't thought of that. And so I think that what you just brought up, David, it basically is also saying we're open to some other ideas. And I think that's exactly where we need to be right now, because maybe the way that we've always graded is not the best way to grade in this situation, and maybe asking the student their preference could actually be better. I mean, we're discovering and we'll see. So I think that openness to that is important. And I'm glad to see that schools are considering different ways.
And Ken, we have a question from another member of our audience with regards to dealing with colleagues who are not prepared to think through culturally relevant approaches because they're distracted by the crisis itself, right? We have so many people, and we're finding this, that the crisis itself is overwhelming their day job, right? And so what would you recommend for people trying to think through culturally relevant approaches, but the crisis has them distracted, so that may be lost? So the question is in regards to helping colleagues keep their eye on that diversity ball.
Well, my response to that is first, personal safety is paramount. A person's not going to give you their best thinking or their best relations or any type of collaborative expertise if they feel unsafe. You got to take care of yourself. And so I would suggest to anybody, first things first, make sure you find yourself every day in a safe and secure environment so that you can give your best thinking and you can be the best partner to reaching solutions as possible. Assuming that you have done that, then I would think that you want to prepare yourself to recognize the realities of your circumstance, whatever institution you're at or however you find yourself. And in terms of movement toward online, we always have to start with our basics. And for many faculty, here's the truth. We teach the way we were taught.
That's right.
And that's the bottom line. Yeah. And so that's your ground zero. Now you have to expand and truly engage in what Kelly and Amber are talking about. And I'll put it in just in my own terms. We're talking about moving from your ground zero to a degree and level and capacity of modality that accommodates as many different types of students as possible. To do that, you've got some personal issues to address yourself. Okay, you have to relearn and unlearn at the same time. You have to engage, and in some cases, you have to step back in order to be effective for as many students as possible. A critical thing to not forget in that process is to not ignore the diversity that you don't see. Because when you're going to go online, there's going to be people with different abilities, genders, ages, sexuality, etc., that are looking for that knowledge transfer from you. Or if you're an administrator, they're looking for a system that allows faculty to transfer knowledge in a more equity-minded and culturally relevant process. So I would say try to build your case toward diversifying yourself and your pedagogy, starting with yourself. First, secure yourself. Second, recognize who you are and what your foundation for instruction has been, and then build from there with relevant expertise and support.
Thank you so much, Ken. And we have another question from our audience. And I would like both Amber and Kelly to answer this question. This question is coming in from an academic success coach who says that their institution has a large number of first-generation students, over 60% first-generation. And as we know, with first-generation students, college is already hard enough, according to this person, as we know, in terms of getting acclimated to the concept of being on campus and residence halls and lecture halls. And for the first-generation student, having to go online all of a sudden, this person is finding that a lot of these students are dropping off, are falling away. And so the question is, how do we help these kind of students, they say, quote unquote, fear freeze, when you can't have these conversations in person to try to counsel them? The issue of the first generation student, how do we help them who, when it comes to making this transition without being able to coach them one-on-one, which ordinarily we'd want to do? And I want to ask that question concerning the first generation student to Amber, and also like Kelly to weigh in, please.
So I'm in the same situation, and I had tried to simplify it for my students, and I said you need a calendar, a partner, and professor, CPP, real simple. And I was trying to think of something they could remember. So with the calendar, it meant that you have to understand that you are going to take control of your time. So I want you to sit down when you get your syllabus, and I want you to go ahead and I want you to go ahead, put in there when things are due, then backtrack and put when you're going to work on them. And then I want you to find a partner in each of your classes that you form a relationship with. I told them to have study sessions and things together. I said, you don't have to have a formal study session. Grab a pizza, sit down and have some fun studying with this partner in this session. And professor, I said, talk to your professor, send emails, ask questions, communicate, set up office hours. I've seen some faculty that just leave it open for their office hours and people can just kind of chime in, but set up those kinds of things. So I said calendar, partner, professor, because I felt like it was really important to simplify it for the student. The other thing that I find, like she or he said, you might not be able to meet them one-on-one, right? And so maybe it's good to have opportunities for group conversations. So I've set up things like lunches, just having a group come together and us being able to share, because a lot of this has to do with us leaning on each other, right? So I think that kind of support is that kind of support is important.
Amber, I am totally stealing the CPP thing because I love that.
Well, we said it here, so it's covered. You can have it now.
All right, awesome.
Thank you, Diverse. Thank you, guys.
The only thing that I would add to that is, because that's actually all great advice, and I also think that we need to think through, or what resources we have at our disposal when those students start reaching out for assistance. And so at the University of Phoenix, again, this is one of those examples of where we have long thought through, what do we do to help students when they are at a distance from us? And so our team in disability services, our academic counselors that work with all of the students, we all have mechanisms in place to be able to walk students through on the phone. So let's say the student calls in and says, I don't know how to access Blackboard Collaborate from my computer. Well, even if you don't have tools like GoToAssist, which allow an agent to open up a window with the student and take over their desktop and show them things, you still have that ability in either Skype, in Microsoft Teams, in Zoom. I mean, these are all resources that are out there and available. If your institution isn't using any of the Microsoft suite, Zoom is free, and you can do up to a 45-minute web meeting with a student. And the student you can walk them through how to share their desktop, and you can be able to show them things and be able to kind of highlight for them where things are and how they work. We have found that to be invaluable in terms of supporting the students. So be thinking through how to use those resources that you have in ways that you wouldn't have thought of. I think one of the kind of threads that I'm hearing about for a lot of our conversation this morning, or actually the afternoon, I think I'm probably the only one who it's still the morning for, is the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty, and there's a lot that we take for granted that our students may already know that they actually don't. So thinking through, what does it mean for a student when all they have is a mobile phone and they don't actually have a computer? Walk those things through. Where can you put those resources? Where can you document, quick articles, blog posts, those sorts of things on your website, on your special page that most of us probably have set up, in response to the virus. Putting those things all in one place so the student can, go there with a question about, maybe it's about staying on campus and access to a meal plan, but they see here's a tutorial on how to use Zoom. Well, I didn't even think about that. Okay, now maybe I can use that to set up a virtual study meeting with my partner from that, math class that I know I'm going to struggle through. And so, really kind of, showing students where those resources are and how to access them.
Thank you so very much. Thank you so very much. We are out of time. There are so many other questions to pose so many other issues that we have discussed. Kelly, Amber, Ken, I thank you so very much for your expertise, for being a resource for our audience. And audience, I just wanted to let you know that this won't be the last time. Looking at the experts, this is going to get worse perhaps before it gets better when it comes to our need to social distance. But in the meantime, issues of access, equity, equal opportunity are not going away. And we look forward to here at Diverse being a resource, along with Kupalo and many others, for expertise on how best to do this when it comes to advancing diversity. So panelists, thank you so much. Audience, thank you so much. I would look forward to doing this again in the near future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks everyone for joining us today. And we hope to see you next time. Thank you very much, and have a good and safe weekend. Thank you.